90 minutes. I'm Richard Ponzio from the Stimson Center, where I direct the Just Security 2020 program. It's truly a pleasure to have everybody here. And you have kindly and correctly chosen the correct session to be at for the next 90 minutes. We're going to be looking at the theme, A Global Civic Ethic, Countering Rising Nationalism and the Future of Global Governance. And before I introduce our truly exceptional panelists, I wish to make two brief scene-setting points. First, my own personal introduction to the notion of a global civic ethic came during the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, way back in 1995, initially in the form of the Baha'i Faith's inspirational turning point statement, for which you're going to be hearing echoes of from one of our remarkable speakers shortly. At around the same time, the Commission on Global Governance brought out its seminal Our Global Neighborhood Report. As you can see, I've gone through this very carefully, lots of Post-it notes. If you know me, Post-it notes. And as you can, but its commissioners stated, and I quote, "The changes of the last half century have brought the global neighborhood nearer to reality, a world in which citizens are increasingly dependent on one another and need to cooperate. We believe that a global civic ethic to guide action within the global neighborhood and leadership infused with that ethic are vital to the quality of global governance." They then proceeded to outline 8 major rights of all people, including, and I'll just give a few sampling, a secure life, equitable treatment, and an opportunity to earn a fair living and provide for their own welfare. The commissioners also identified 7 major responsibilities of all people, including to promote equity, including gender equity, protect the interests of future generations by pursuing sustainable development and safeguarding the global commons, and be active participants in governance, including global governance, the subject of our discussions these 3 days. Building on these foundation stones from UN 50, my second and final introductory point is that, especially in an age of rising nationalism, modernizing and making more inclusive our institutions of global governance requires more than creative and often technocratic proposals recommending new tools and structural change, as you have been hearing and you hopefully will hear staying with us the next 2 days during this forum. True global governance transformation must also be underpinned by compelling moral and ethical vision for a more just, inclusive, sustainable, and peaceful world, drawing insights and teachings from the major world religions, philosophers, public intellectuals, and other global civil society actors. Our session today will speak to the moral and ethical principles associated with the emergence of a global civic ethic and the accompanying notions of global responsibility and citizenship. The roots of and effective strategies for countering exclusive forms of a nationalism, which can indeed undermine and erode efforts to strengthen global cooperation and responsibility, will also be explored. As you've heard by now from our moderators in previous sessions, to save ample time for our discussion and debate today, we kindly refer you to our forum's website for the complete bios of our 4 accomplished speakers. But in the order that I will soon call on them initially for our first round of questions, let me mention, we'll hear first from Lisa John, who is the Secretary General of Civicus, which is a global alliance of civil society organizations and activists dedicated to strengthening citizen action and civil society throughout the world. Then we'll hear from Her Excellency Ms. Lowa Al-Qatar, Assistant Foreign Minister and spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Qatar and Executive Director of the Doha Forum. Thirdly is Safira Rameshwar, representative at the United Nations New York office of the Baha'i International Community. And finally, batting cleanup today is Professor Thomas Weiss, who is the presidential professor at the City University of New York Graduate Center, former president of the International Studies Association, and an active leader over the years of the Academic Council on the UN system. Before we begin, I have 3 quick notes, housekeeping and process. We're going to try to make sure that at least the last 30 minutes or so of our discussion is time for hearing your questions. And throughout the session, even in the first coming minutes, we encourage to add your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom webinars, which I'm sure many of you are adept at this point. We also encourage you to use the chat box That's more for what you're hearing from the speakers. You can show encouragement, be, of course, polite and constructive at all times, but we would love for you to share your ideas with the wider community that is in today's program, and share your research as well, and reports that are germane to today's topic. Final housekeeping note that since we will lose one of our speakers, Ms. Alcatar, about 20 minutes before the hour, we will make sure we get her 3 questions in before we have to bid adieu. So with that covered, we're going to turn in a second to Lisa. And what we'll do with these 3 rounds of questions to get our conversation rolling, the first phase, I really want to look at principles and key characteristics, unpack this notion of a global civic ethic. Then we'll turn to the other part of the heading of today's session, countering exclusive forms of nationalism, why this does set a series of roadblocks and impediments to advancing global cooperation writ large. And finally, we'll delve into what I call new frontier issues that should build upon our earlier discussion today, and then delve into some of the unaddressed business from coming out of UN 75 and the declaration about to be endorsed by world leaders in a few days' time. Ms. John, how does your global network, Civicus, approach the issues of global solidarity, responsibility, and identity at the heart of the notion of a global civic ethic? And tell us how important it is that intergovernmental processes like the one we've seen recently for the UN 75 declaration that I know your organization contributed deeply to, and then what may follow in 2021 and beyond. Why is it so important that these processes are underpinned with certain ideals associated with a global civic ethic? Welcome.
Thank you, Richard. And it's great to go from working alone at home the whole day to suddenly being with 100+ people in the evening. So really looking forward to the reactions and insights that we get from the people who've joined this meeting as well. In response to your question, I think this year has been a consistent reminder that the interconnectedness and the interdependence of the solutions we bring to the biggest challenges we face as a humanity is something we just cannot walk away from. And that's been constant, right? Not just in terms of the health dimensions of the pandemic, but also all of the other inequalities and deprivations that it has really brought to the fore in different parts of the world. And therefore, the question of responsibility, of solidarity, of identity is so fundamental to how we need to reshape how we behave and act and think of ourselves as citizens, but also what we need to demand from governments and institutions that represent governments as well. So just to unpack that a little, I think across the world, we're seeing, public polls and a lot of public statements of citizens and people and communities really wanting governments to step up in terms of providing genuine and transformative leadership. So we're hearing, that this is the first time in many, many years and possibly many decades that there's such a strong demand for governments to be bold in the reforms they take forward, and not piecemeal reforms. I mean, reforms in terms of really systemic issues which really talk to the heart of inequality or climate or democracy, and really address the structures that are keeping people suppressed or apart or deprived wherever they are. And in doing that, I think governments need to step up and really craft that new narrative of development and of rights that kind of hold us together, and we kind of deserve and we should be able to kind of engage with and act on going forward. But it also means that as citizens, we have the responsibility to shed that kind of narrow notion of citizenship, that idea of us being citizens in connection with all the paradigms we engage with. So whether it's our neighborhoods, whether it's our identity as consumers.
We are losing your connection, your audio connection, Ms. John.
Identity as digital.
My apologies, Ms. John. We are losing your audio, but we will come back to you.
Is this better? Maybe I should put off my video and.
Yes, and I think we were hearing you well. So please continue, and kindly wrap up your first response as well.
Great. So you're asking me to continue, right?
Yes, please.
Oh, great. Okay. So just to say that it also requires us to rethink our identity as citizens, and in doing so, then demand that international institutions embrace radical reforms in how citizen participation is experienced. So we no longer should be content with representative forms of engaging with the UN, for instance. And the UN at 75 is a really key moment for us to be pushing for new forms by which people can engage with decision makers directly and at the same level.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That's a great way to get us off and rolling on this important conversation. Ms. Al-Khattar, please tell us, before we get into your work with the Doha Forum and issues you might be doing with the state of Qatar, we know that you have been, for many years, a scholar about Islamic history and principles. And of course, the world's great religions are a source of inspiration of moral and ethical teachings for billions of people on the urgent need for a sense of global community and responsibility across borders. So share with us, especially how Islamic principles tell us about fostering the emergence of a global civic ethic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ponzio, for the invitation, and I'm very glad and honored to be with the distinguished panelists, and very proud actually of our partnership between Doha Forum and the Stimson Center. Now, the question of Islam and modernity, religion and modernity in general, is one of the fascinating topics, as you can imagine. It's almost impossible to cover this in a few minutes, but I would like to refer your audience to the work of one of the greatest anthropologists of religion of our time, that is Talal Asad. Specifically his book, Formations of the Secular, Christianity, Islam, and Modernity. And if they wish to consult another piece of his work, Genealogies of Religion, would be a good source as well. Now, I beg your pardon because I'm going to focus on Islam just because I happen to know more about Islam, but I think and I believe that many of the elements that I'm going to tackle equally applies to other religions. So Islam in general revolves around two central notions, the text and the context, the scriptures basically, and the context. And throughout the history, we had different schools of thought. Some of them are more text-oriented, such as traditionalists, and some of them are more context-oriented, such as rationalists, empiricists, positivists, and so on and so forth. But in between, there was this school of thought that is called the Maqasidi school. Maqasid means intents, objectives. And the idea there is that any religion, including Islam, would have main objectives. And hence, both the text and the context can be reinterpreted in order to uphold those objectives. Throughout the Islamic history, we had theorists who explicitly talked about that in the 3rd Islamic century, that is almost the 9th Gregorian century. There was Imam al-Amri, and then after that, Imam al-Juwayni, his disciple Imam al-Ghazali. After that, al-Shatibi. Al-Shatibi was the peak of that school at that time, that is the 13th Gregorian century. But then in the 20th century, we had the Tunisian scholar Al-Tahir bin Ashur. And after that, a number of his disciples. Nowadays, they focus on five main objectives. And those speak directly to your question, if I may. At least 4 of them. One of them is basically حفظ النفس, the protection of human life. The protection of human life in general. And this should stand against any interpretation of the text that would harm human life, or any dictation of the context, such as unbounded technological advancements, for example, nuclear weapons. And then we have the second objective, that is the preservation and development of dignity, human dignity. And this speaks directly to the notion of human rights. And then the third objective is the preservation and development of, in classical work, they call it offspring. In more modern work, they talk about family and the right of future generations, basically. And once again, this speaks to many of the notions that we were talking about when we speak about sustainability and so on and so forth. And then the fourth one is the preservation and development of wealth, or in modern interpretations, resources. And once again, this is not to abuse the environment, not to abuse the resources that we have as human beings. And what's even more interesting is the preservation of religion and development of religion. And it's interesting because even classical scholars did not talk about the preservation of Islam, but of religion. And that's why modern interpreters of that say that what's meant by this is the preservation of one's right to choose. That's very important. Free will, the notion of free will. And I'll conclude with this comment. I guess the main point here is that we can always reinterpret many of the religious notions in modern contexts, and at the same time not be unfaithful to the original objectives that the text aimed to basically realize and fulfill. And that's the end of my contribution here.
Thank you very, very much. Perfect framing of some of the core principles, not only from one of the world's great religions, but I think it speaks to many of the world's religions at this time, and thinking of great philosophers and thinkers on the issues that we're exploring in this discussion. Professor Weiss, if we can have you move something that is blocking part of your screen. There we go. And I will turn though to to Safira. Please tell us, of course, the world has changed since the UN was founded 75 years ago. What do you see as key features of the current system of global governance? And are they suited to an increasingly interdependent and interconnected world that we find ourselves? Look no further than the pandemic we're all experiencing. In your response, I really hope I made a reference to the turning point statement from UN 50, 25 years ago. Please share with us the latest statement in honor of the 75th anniversary of the UN from the Baha'i international community.
Thank you so much, Richard. And it's so wonderful to be here with all of you this afternoon. Yes, so the Baha'i international community does have a new statement for the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, which will be released on the 21st of September. But today, maybe I can just highlight a few key elements of that statement. And as you mentioned, Richard, yes, like as more pressing and interconnected challenges are emerging for our global community, we are compelled to devise new arrangements that address the needs of the time. So as humanity is increasingly becoming more and more interdependent, we find ourselves now having to purposefully organize our affairs in full consciousness of ourselves as one people in one shared homeland. So one of the features of a system of global governance that is geared towards more interconnectedness is this commitment to the oneness of humanity. And this idea that humankind is one, it sounds very simple, but it actually has a profound implication in terms of the reordering of our priorities. Too often the advancement of the common good is approached as a secondary objective. It's commendable, but it's to be pursued only after narrower national interests have been secured. So the principle of the oneness of humanity forces us to ask new questions. So for example, what will be the global implications of domestic policies? Or what choices contribute to shared prosperity and sustainable peace around the world? So leaders and policymakers will have to consider at every level, including local, national, international, how a decision will advance the good of humankind in its entirety. And this will demand a far more holistic and coherent approach to decision-making and analysis, and will lead to a process defined by greater inclusivity, coherence, and collaboration. So that's one key feature, and I know we don't have so much time to go into many of them, but maybe one more feature that I'll mention is being able to institutionalize a process of learning. And so we want to be thinking less in terms of events and short-term policies, and more about a long-term process-oriented approach to progress. So when we see ourselves as active partners in a collective learning process, particularly as we're looking to the future, towards, say, the centenary of the United Nations and beyond, we're wanting to look at this longer arc of the journey of humanity, which will allow us then to navigate each step with more confidence and more clarity and trust in the commitment of nations to learn from one another. And we're able to shape now the narrative of humanity's progress over time. So these are some features that maybe will allow us to make decisions around what next steps are, to turn each next step into a stepping stone towards this future, and also to kind of be able to navigate a system of global governance that is geared towards a more unified and interconnected approach to humanity's destiny.
Thank you, Safira. And we'll be eager to see this latest statement. Please share it with our team, who you know well now, and we will make sure it's in our daily recaps everybody will be receiving that are signed up as participants of this forum each evening around 6 p.m. New York time. Turning to Professor Weiss, you were the head of the Secretariat for the commission that brought about the notion of a responsibility to protect. It was in 2001, I believe, just after the World Trade Center attacks. And 4 years later, UN 60, another major anniversary, it was adopted, the notion of a responsibility to protect by world leaders. How does it embody this idea that we're discussing, a universal civic ethic? And equally important, has the international community lived up to the ideals associated with the responsibility to protect?
Well, I can answer the question first, no, but let me say a few other things first. Thanks for this opportunity, and to you and the other organizers for allowing these conversations. Let's just recall for a minute the responsibility to protect, which is not a religious reflection, but a secular humanist notion, after all. So if a state is manifestly unable or unwilling to protect its citizens, or is actually the perpetrator of abuse, which is frequently the case, it's the responsibility of the international community of states to react and to come to the rescue. But I said the straightforward answer to your question is no. The UN and its member states have not lived up to these ideals any more than we've lived up to a number of other noble aspirations. We only have to point at Syria or Myanmar for R2P, but you could point to grueling poverty, illiteracy, female genital mutilation as black eyes for the Sustainable Development Goals. I think the better question, frankly, is for a universal ethic, are we moving actually in the right normative direction for acting occasionally to sustain a new ideal? Are we helping to nudge along a emerging norm and moving from a participle, emerging, to an emerged norm, to one that we respect more and more of the time? It seems to me that the rigid application of moral absolutes, religion or secular, is a rather unreasonable expectation for 193 member states. So let's be a little more utilitarian. I think in terms of an ethic, there are two elements that are really important for the future. The first is a shift away from the vocabulary of humanitarian intervention, which put the emphasis on the rights of outsiders to come to intervene, shifts that to the rights of victims on the ground to protection and assistance. So that shift is really quite critical. The second part, I think, that's even more important for this group is the redefinition of state sovereignty as anything except absolute. It's contingent on a modicum of respect for human rights. But we shouldn't get too excited here. This is a step in the right direction, but we're not really setting the bar very high. Let's recall that we're not trying to stop the garden variety of human rights abuse that occurs daily everywhere. We're really trying to stop mass murder, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. So it seems to me that, let's put this in context, this is not a huge high moral bar. It's pretty low. And so when we fail, we got to keep that in mind. It seems to me, that said, however, that there are some real indications that some governments are taking this seriously. The Security Council has referred to it since 2005, as you mentioned, the decision by the World Summit, 84 times in resolutions, and the Human Rights Council another 50. And it seems to me that there are lots of problems which we can discuss with the intervention in Libya. But it suggests that occasionally we can say something like, no more Holocausts, no more Cambodias, no more Rwandas, and occasionally mean it. So for those who are upset by inconsistency and double standards, why Libya, why not Syria? I'd like to point out that part of our moral and ethical journey, we used to have a single standard, not a double standard. We used to have a single standard, do nothing. And now occasionally we act. Thanks.
Thank you. Extremely important. And I think when we get to later questions, we're going to hear more of I will want to explore with you R2P, and then with Lisa John, the shrinking civic space. We even heard that from our moderator this morning, from Miriam Namazi, pushing back on gains that we've seen on safeguarding human rights, promoting basic freedoms. Democracy and R2P were common terms only 15 years ago in most major declarations. People are worried that we're seeing a real pushback just in the consensus around this terminology, let alone its actual action on the ground, the policies that are implemented by the UN. So turning back then to Ms. Alcatar, we did want to hear about your work through the Doha Forum. And of course, as you mentioned in your introduction, we were also very much honored at the Stimson Center to collaborate with you and your colleagues on the Doha Forum report last year on reimagining governance in a multipolar world. It offered 10 principles aimed at strengthening governance and collective action across borders. So looking at these 10 principles, could you share with us which of the 10, maybe one or two if you could share as examples, speak to notions of global responsibility, solidarity, and citizenship?
Thank you very much, Dr. Ponzio. If you allow me, I'll just state them all very quickly, and then I'll focus on one of them. Thank you. So one is resolving conflicts peacefully through dialogue. The second one is ensuring inclusive, open, and fair decision-making, upholding international law, respecting the sovereign equality of all states, strengthening international institutions, advancing human rights, and a global civic ethic, safeguarding intergenerational rights and responsibilities, embracing diversity and tolerating dissent, investing in human capital, and conserving and regenerating natural resources. Now, the one I want to focus on the most is the first one, resolving conflicts peacefully and through dialogue. I know when people hear the 10 of them would feel like, what can I do as an individual or as an institution? Each one of us has something to contribute. In Doha Forum, as you know, our motto is about diversity, dialogue, and diplomacy. And this point specifically speaks, resolving conflicts peacefully through dialogue speaks to what we're trying to achieve in Doha Forum. Representation of everyone. And Richard, you've been to the forum, and I believe you saw that. Representation in terms of regions, gender, religions, ideologies, and so on and so forth. In every single panel that we have, we try to have a representation of everyone. Our ratio, for example, in terms of gender, 3-to-1, I know it's not ideal, but if you compare it to other fora, you're talking about 14-to-1 in terms of 14 men to 1 woman, and so on and so forth. So we're trying to walk the talk. Now, only a few days ago in Doha, if you recall, there was the historic meeting between the different Afghan factions. That was the first meeting in 40 years. 40 years of war. Now everyone is realizing that this will not end through war. And all of them came back to the table of negotiations. My very simple message here, every modern war that we know of ended at the table of negotiations. Let's just cut it short. We already know the conclusion and the end of it. Let's just save ourselves, our planet, our people, pains and miseries. My colleague spoke about Libya, Syria, and other places. Let's just stop that, go directly to the table of negotiations, try to build bridges, facilitate talks, and hopefully we can reach results with less losses, basically.
That's an incredibly important point. And, you know, since our meeting at its heart, global institutions and the UN at the center, really the apex of the international system, created 75 years ago, the very first words in the preamble, to prevent the scourge of war. Why do you feel, in the case of Afghanistan, where the UN has been engaged, I believe since the late 70s when war first broke out, the poor country has suffered for so many decades, and now in this last iteration since the Bonn process in 2001, we, as you just said, only got the parties together in your capital of Doha in the last couple of weeks. Why is it taking so long, and is this a failure of the United Nations and the international community at large?
I don't want to burden the United Nations. At the end of the day, the UN is the representation of the collective will of individual countries. I think we reached this point at this point of time simply because neighbors to Afghanistan, as well as some other international and regional actors, decided to come together. So once again, the UN is, until this very moment, is the best forum that we know of to bring our problems to. Maybe in 10, 20 years, we come up with something that is better. But for the time being, let's not burden it with our own individual failures as states and countries.
And then turning back to the UN's work writ large, global cooperation, could you just share, before we lose you in the next few minutes, some more thinking on our general theme of moral and ethical principles? Why is it so very central to the functioning of these institutions? Because all of the other sessions at this forum will really get into institutional various tools and mechanisms to improve global governance, to help its peacemaking work that we were just discussing. But back to these moral and ethical principles, how do they deal with what is a very real concern for many of us in this community, countering negative and exclusive forms of nationalism, which really undercut the very notion of global cooperation?
My answer will be twofold. One is more of a moral argument. The other one is more of a pragmatic one. The moral argument is very simple and straightforward. I had a discussion with a political scientist. He calls himself a realist. I call him a pessimist, honestly. Basically, he thinks that the only motivation that individuals and hence institutions and hence states have is purely interest. Interest that is free of any other values, such as justice and so on and so forth. So by the end of the discussion, I asked him just one question, and he never answered. I said, if this was true, why is it the case that even the most brutal dictators find themselves obliged to resort to moral justifications, to do things in the name of religion, in the name of the people, in the name of social justice, and so on and so forth? If that was not intrinsic in our very human nature, longing to values beyond pure interest, if that wasn't the case, then we wouldn't be, such dictators would not be feeling the obligation to resort to such arguments. So that's the moral argument. The pragmatic one is very simple and straightforward. Dr. Ponzio, during COVID-19, there isn't a single country that was able to operate individually. Everyone looked at its neighbors or looked at the WHO or other institutions, even those who questioned those institutions, by the way. So in an interconnected world, it's just impossible. It's impossible. It's I mean, we have, what we're living in is the result of technological advancements and very, very complicated systems and processes. It's just impossible to reverse that impact, that result of interconnectedness. And hence, we have to work together, whether we like it or not. It's very, very simple. And if I may end with just one example, even those radical nationalistic groups that you just referenced in your question, even those groups, by the way, are the same groups who are utilizing the most, quote unquote, global instruments to disseminate their ideas, to actually, I mean, if you look at the supranational activity that is happening across countries and continents between those groups, sharing knowledge and so on and so forth, it's just interesting. I mean, the juxtaposition there, the contrast there between the practice and the thesis is just amazing and astonishing. And many of them are very much associated with a huge capitalist machinery as well, right? Transnational companies and so on and so forth. So even for them to practice what they're preaching, it's not happening. So once again, morality in our governance is not only a kind of moral or teleological need. No, it's a practical, pragmatic need.
Thank you so much. Very thought-provoking, connecting the principles and moral ethical principles that we're looking at to the practical. We extremely appreciate your contributions and, of course, your continued leadership on these questions. But we know we have to bid you adieu today, so thank you for joining our forum, and we hope that you and your colleagues will be able to cover different parts of the forum the next 3 days.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to watching the rest of this session once it's uploaded. And thank you to my colleagues.
We'll send it to you today. All the best. And now turning back to Tom Weiss, building on the question I posed to Ms. Alcatar about the worries concerning the resurgence of exclusive nationalism. We've seen the very practical effects it's had on these institutions created in the aftermath 75 years ago of World War II, specifically defunding of major agencies, pulling out of major agencies and agreements, most importantly in recent years, the Paris Climate Agreement by one major country that we're all aware of. We'd like for you to maybe draw on, though, some of your historical perspective from a famous project you've been leading, the UN Intellectual History Project, and also if you could share what you're thinking in the course of that project about a third UN. Please define the third UN notion and why it's important for us to understand these trends and looking at global civil society, how civil society actors can work with like-minded governments and pushing back against the trend of exclusive nationalism.
15 very easy questions, Richard, in 3 minutes. I think the place to start is that we're at a truly depressing moment to be drinking champagne remotely this year. And it's not just the UN, it's multilateralism, it's cooperation in any form that's under siege. The people on this webinar and in general this week, you know, we're a chorus of singing a cosmopolitan choir, singing the praises of a global citizenship and ethic, etc. But the age of me first is a totally different tonality. And it's not just the theme song, Alas, of Trump, but it's of Putin, it's of Xi, it's Erdogan, Bolsonaro, Duterte, Orban, and right-wing cabals everywhere. And I think that most importantly for a discussion of the UN, we can't forget that the global South, and in particular emerging powers, are also in the process of lambasting post-war multilateral organizations as relics of the past, of an order that was made by and for the West. So that the onslaught here is pretty significant. You asked for 2 thoughts. Let me try. The first is, and this goes back in history, this is the 75th anniversary, so it's worthwhile going back to 1945 and the existential threat from the German Reich and the Japanese Empire. Most people think about the UN as somehow being born in San Francisco and coming into effect in October of 1945, but it really is important to go back to the 1st of January of 1942 for the birth of the United Nations in Washington, D.C. on the 1st of January, when 26 and later 44 allies signed the Declaration by United Nations. This was not only a label for a military alliance to crush fascism, but it also entailed multilateral collaboration of all sorts as the best way to proceed, not only during the war, but in the post-war period. So why do I want to go back to 1942 to 45? because in many ways, the 1940s represented a kind of pinnacle, a summit of global intergovernmental governance. No one questions the effort made by the United States and allies, not even the current crew of My Country First. And speaking of ethics, the wartime United Nations contradicts the conventional wisdom that liberalism was somehow abandoned to confront fascism. It shows that the ideals, actually, since we're talking about ethics, the ideals of Kant were actually found to be essential to the Hobbesian project of survival. So multilateralism then and now is a way to solve problems when governments decide to use them. So thanks, Richard, for referring back to the Intellectual History Project. So my second thought actually reflects 100 oral histories and 15 university press books, namely that the UN's comparative advantage is not concrete operations, which is the topic for virtually all of the reform efforts. Who could be against better peacekeeping, vaccinating kids better, humanitarian relief? They're certainly valuable. But the real payoff and the real multiplier comes from ideas, norms, principles, standards, and monitoring them. And that's why people in this webinar, I presume, haven't looked at the whole list of participants, and civil society in general is directly pertinent. It is part of what Sir Richard Jolly and Tatiana Karayanis and I dubbed the Third UN about 10 years ago, which consists of supportive non-state actors, intellectual scholars, consultants, think tanks, NGOs, for-profit sector, the media. That Third UN are actors that interact and support the intergovernmental machinery of the first UN of member states and the second UN of international civil service. So it seems to me that in helping the UN to think, which is actually for a bit of cheap publicity, the subtitle to a book that's coming out early next year by Tatiana and me about the Third UN, helping the UN think, particularly in this moment when it's not obvious that cooperation, except to the group in this webinar, that cooperation is the way to solve a pandemic or climate change. We're circling the wagons. And so it's important to keep this rather ugly moment in mind as we try to move beyond it. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you so much, Tom. And we'll be sure to include maybe that publication, but your whole intellectual history project in our UN 75 resources to be shared in our daily updates. Turning back to Lisa, as we said in the introduction, your core work protecting civic space at all levels of governance, it seems to be under attack. And as we've heard from several of our panelists and throughout the full program today, tell us why the work that you do to protect civic space, to defend basic human rights, why is it so central to this broader issue of global cooperation and focusing on the need for civic action for current and future generations?
Thanks, and I hope you can hear me better now. If the sound does go off, it's just a reminder of the digital divide, right, between the global north and the global south. So, I think it's a really important question, and I'm going to try and frame it linking to some of the comments, that my co-panelists have made. It's some really interesting points on just the history of, how we've got here, the importance of negotiation and solidarity. But at this point in time, I think we're seeing two very distinct trends. One, we run a tracker on civic freedoms called the Civicus Monitor. And even before the pandemic hit us, we were seeing this very depressing, statistic of just merely 3% of the world's population actually living in contexts where they can freely exercise their civic freedom. So the freedom of expression, association, and assembly. In addition to that, 40% of the world's population lives in repressed contexts, and that's double of the number that we were seeing in 2018 and 2019. So it's twice the number, and particularly because of regressions in populous countries like India, where I come from, and Nigeria. So on one hand, we've seen that things are getting far worse in terms of how we assert and exercise our civic freedoms and our rights as citizens. But on the other hand, this has also been the decade of people power. And since, from the early days of the Tunisian revolution, you're seeing a constant, kind of a marching, a calling out for better systems, for reforms, for the ideas of justice and equality and equity and peace that the UN represents. And I think that's a real sign of hope. It really means that all of the complex conversations we're having in webinars has really, it's being experienced by people on the ground. People are not happy with piecemeal solutions, piecemeal kind of explanations of how things are being done by governments. And people want a direct voice in national, subnational, and global systems. And I think a lot of the ideas we're talking about in the context of UN at 75 years, whether it's the World Citizens Initiative, an elected UN parliament, is essentially not about the structure or the form. It's essentially about people having the space to express their views, but also express dissent. And the most important, I think, learning curve for governments right now is to understand how to engage constructively with new social movements. Governments who are hitting back, who are suppressing citizens, who are suppressing what they don't want to hear, are governments who are failing, and they're failing miserably. And what the pandemic has done for us, it has shown also alternate forms of governance, right? So all the feminist leaders you've seen, whether it's Taiwan or Germany or New Zealand, feminist leaders have stepped up and showed a different form of governance, which people have recognized and shifting priorities.
We are having, if you could switch back to audio only again. Sorry, Lisa. If you could continue with audio only, maybe we can hear you better. Sorry about that. And I was just itching to get to a follow-up
question.
I
ended my... I did end my intervention.
Well, I had a follow-on question to that.
Yes, yeah.
If I can ask, COVID-19 is on our mind. Are authoritarian governments in particular, and also these governments I call becoming extremely nationalist, turning inward and against global cooperation, are these clearly becoming, is the pandemic an opportunity to further restrain the gains that civic actors have made in many countries in just in the last couple of years?
I'd say definitely yes, but I'm not going to end in a doom and gloom situation. I think the yes in terms of that is that you're seeing an increasing number of governments who were already suppressing civic freedoms use the pandemic to reinforce their and exercise their authority over citizens and civil society. The main trends really are in relation to, censorship is like the #1 trend that has kind of exponentially grown across countries. So not just civil society, but even ordinary publics commenting on the measures that have been introduced on social media, platform, being punished, being arrested, being harassed, doctors, for instance, or medical staff asking for protective equipment being, kind of challenged and attacked for mentioning that. So I think what it has done is governments have pushed back harder, but citizens are now appreciating what activists and journalists have gone through all of these years, because even ordinary citizens in their homes are being picked out and kind of harassed for just speaking out their opinion. And I think that's the opportunity we really need to attach ourselves on. The other, kind of challenge and opportunity both for us is really the digital aspect of how we express our civic freedoms. And there's a really important piece of work to be done on protecting, freedom of expression, assembly, and association in the digital context, and understanding how surveillance works and how surveillance is working to promote attacks and sometimes fatal attacks on activists and the media especially. And I think that calls for new learning, but also new norms, right? And new safeguards that we need the UN and other international institutions and regional bodies to start talking about much more actively and putting in place. And the Secretary General's, the UN Secretary General's call to action on human rights earlier this year is a really positive step in that direction. And I think we really need more leaders from across the world to be stepping up and reinforcing these calls, to be reaffirming that citizens' rights cannot be taken for granted.
Thank you, Lisa. Your response has really lit up our chat function on Zoom. We encourage more contributions like the ones we're seeing. And of course, your research products are also very much welcome. And let me use this opportunity to say the Q&A function, we're getting a lot of questions answered in, but we do want to welcome further. We have a team to organize your questions coming in so we can get through as many as possible during the last 30 minutes of our program, which is coming up at the top of the hour. And in this next engagement question with Safira, we have a special surprise. I'll just leave it at that. So stay tuned on this next response, because we're going to hear about Safira's work with the Baha'i community, where you emphasize the oneness of humanity and a sense of belonging in to an emerging global civilization. So how have you seen these ideas put into practice, and how do you think they will need to be translated into action going forward?
Thank you, Richard. Yes, so on this point of a global civilization and the oneness of humanity, being part of a global civilization means that everyone is given the opportunity to make a vital contribution to the rich tapestry that is humanity. So we're striving to be sharing and learning from elements of culture and our shared knowledge that enhance our ability to unite and grow, and at the same time to be able to leave behind elements of culture which serve to divide us. So the worldwide Baha'i community is involved in an educational process that is active in over 180 countries around the world, but that is really focusing on empowering local populations to take charge of their own development and to make a collective contribution to the betterment of their neighborhoods and their societies, and ultimately to the fortunes of humanity. And these processes are at once a very specialized local initiative relevant to a particular cultural or geographic context, while simultaneously being connected to an international movement, an international framework of action, and an international learning process. And so this is something that the Baha'i community is really learning actively about. It's how these contributions of diverse populations can be harmonized into one coherent movement forward. And so I guess the surprise that Richard was alluding to is that I wanted to show just a couple of minutes of a film clip that demonstrates this connection between the local and the global. It's titled Global Vision, Local Action. And really to just show tangible examples of what this looks like at the grassroots, to be actively involved in the betterment of your local context, while at the same time serving a coherent international movement and working towards that development together. So if we can cue that film, that would be wonderful. Thank you. I'm sorry that sound wasn't working.
But the beauty of these videos, and we'll not only be showing all of today's sessions in our recap that I keep promoting, keep your eye out for that around 6 p.m. New York time, but we'll be sure to get that technical glitch fixed. Our apologies, Safira, because it is a wonderful video. It was good to see just the images and the text that we saw on the screen, but we'll send around the full video as a separate link as well in the coming hours. Now, we have this is going to be our rapid fire round, because I really want to save as much of the last half an hour that's coming up on the hour for our Q&A, and there's been a flood of great questions, including discussion via chat. But so I would kindly request answers to be particularly brief. But turning first to Tom, of course, as we said at the outset, we have the declaration from 193 world leaders, the newest anniversary marking tool, the UN 75 Political Declaration being endorsed on Monday. As it relates to the discussion that we've been having, is it a step forward, both in terms of its principles that were reaffirmed in it, and then these specific actions that are referenced under 12 headings as commitments for action?
Richard, at the risk of now being accused of swearing in church or the mosque or the temple, I'd argue, frankly, that this declaration's lack of specificity is not a step forward in relationship to the World Summit document of 2005. Annan, at that point, incorrectly described that as a San Francisco moment. It sure as hell was not a San Francisco moment, but there were some concrete steps. The responsibility protect being one, but the Peace Building Commission, the Human Rights Council, there were concrete measures. This is 12 uses of the future tense, we will, which is supposed to imply a commitment. I don't think it does. At a moment when the Security Council can't even find the terms to describe accurately a global pandemic, it seems to me that we need to ask some tough questions about what portions of this organization are capable of doing things better than anyone else on the earth, and which ones we can jettison. The problem is the UN is never good at getting rid of things. It only adds. And it seems to me that if we're only going to add rather than jettison what goes on, we're coming to a very rocky period. It seems to me that modesty is a virtue for the global ethic, as it should be for social scientists. And we need to be weighing options in light of available resources about what institution could and should do and what it can't possibly do. It seems to me that actually the third UN members, we ought to be thinking about what would this institution, and I don't think this is unlikely, do with 10% fewer resources, 25% fewer resources. I think there's going to be a huge financial crunch in the next 5 years. And I think while it's nice to talk about a centenary, I think that if there's going to be a centenary and there's going to be a vibrant organization as opposed to a relic limping along, we need to keep in mind that there was this thing called the League of Nations that actually functioned, sort of, in a rump form between 1939 and 1946. And it's not impossible for me to imagine a UN that looks pretty much like the League of Nations in that period. Haven't gotten rid of it, it still exists, but it's not anything like what the founders intended, and it's not anything like what supposedly is implied in that declaration. So sorry about swearing.
Not at all, and but I'm so glad I chose correctly the ordering of these questions, because to balance out your response, Tom, we'll hear back from Safira. And you know, the emphasis from the Baha'i international community has always been on the role of values, morals, and principles in achieving transformative change. So, you know, tell us the agenda going forward for the UN 75 declaration, the year ahead, the couple of coming years. How do you believe we are laying these ethical foundations that are so important to bring about the structural changes, strengthening of the UN system, and it not becoming a rump organization like we saw with the League of Nations during World War II?
Yeah, this is a really good point, and it is something that the Baha'i community often speaks to is the role that values, morals, and principles achieve in transformative change. And when we look deeply at things, every policy, every structure, every decision reflects our convictions about society. It reflects our convictions about human nature. It reflects our convictions about the way that given rights and responsibilities, for example, inform one another. So it's these underlying assumptions that determine the degree to which any decision will yield collective or universal benefit. And experience has shown that progress for all is not attainable if our material advancement is disconnected from our moral, ethical, and value-based advancement. And one very clear example of this is kind of our world economic order, where over recent decades it has absolutely brought prosperity to many people. But because that growth has been disconnected from these principles of justice and equity, we've also seen that a very small handful of people have disproportionately benefited from the system, while millions have been exploited. And so our values, our morals, our principles must continue to be the object of very careful and honest examination. And that very much implies in the ways that we're looking to move forward, particularly in the next 25 years and to the centenary of the United Nations, to really think about how these principles of material progress and also the development of our value-based system and this kind of shared global ethic, as you were describing earlier, Richard, kind of go hand in hand. And it's only in this way that the promise of a better world can be fulfilled.
Thank you very much, Safira. And last but not least, before we turn to our questions and answers, or we're welcoming more inputs, although we've got a lot to cover in the next half an hour. But very briefly, Safira, just under this rubric of the way forward, what next? Tell us about one of your really important new initiatives, Civic Space Initiative, that you're undertaking between Civicus and Article 19, the International Center for Nonprofit Law. Tell us about the elements of this initiative, and if any of these elements pertain to our discussion on steps for enhancing a global civic ethic.
So that question is meant for me, right? And
yes.
not for Safira, yes.
Did I say Safira? Sorry, Lisa.
I'm happy to hand it over to her. So, no, I think the Civic Space Initiative is like a real representation of the combination of high ambition and very, very hard work on the details at national and subnational levels that need to accompany each other in order to create change for human rights and civic freedoms. And in fact, earlier this week, I was looking through our reports on the last 2 years of the work that's been done through this partnership. And it's incredible to see very, very specific instances of how norm setting or legal or policy building is happening, particularly in the global south, where we don't have a lot of champions of civic freedoms, right? Something related to the use of force protocols in Brazil, for instance, which sounds completely unbelievable right now, at least in what we've seen last year and this year. But it does mean, I think, and the creation of an enabling legal environment for civil society in Ethiopia, which we would have never thought would have been a conversation that would have been possible 5 years ago. So I think it does mean that across systems, whether it's government or civil society or other sectors, there are always going to be individuals who are passionate about doing the right thing and about the ideals that we represent as an international community. So while we can, we need to pay attention to the headlines, we need to respond to the bigger trends, we should never forget that there are people who have the power to shift things. And our business as civil society is to get these kind of catalysts together to shift things and to create the change, which may seem incremental, but are actually quite phenomenal and historic, especially in context where civic freedoms or civil society has never been respected. And I think it's continuously going back to that story. I was saying in another conversation that, especially this year when most of us can't really do much, that we used to do before, you wake up every morning making a choice between hope and despair. And you do that by continuously reinforcing and looking at the change that very, very ordinary people in highly restricted contexts are pushing. We've moved away from that generation that was, that we spoke of earlier, where you would have that one amazing leader who suddenly rose up and led, millions through distress. right now, every single person on the ground has the potential to deliver that leadership. And I think the Hong Kong protest movement really, I mean, framed it really well when they said we are not a leaderless movement, we're a leaderful movement. And that's the core of, you know, the global civic ethic. It just means that we have to reclaim our, you know, our power and our energy to be active citizens, and do it in a way that respects our local context, but also reinforces and strengthens the global norms of human rights and civic freedoms that really bind and connect us together.
Thank you very, very much, Lisa. And as promised, we have a number of questions to get to. I'm going to do groups of 3 and encourage single responses to individual questions by our amazing panelists. And I'll mention who I think could field certain questions, but that you're willing to take a pass and actually respond to one of the other questions that you hear. But from a colleague of Professor Weiss, we have Veselin Popovsky, also a fellow scholar based in Tokyo, Japan. And he writes to us, should ethical norms apply not only in human-human relationships, as we've been talking about, I think, with the R2P principle, but also for human and nature, the natural environment relationships? Do you agree that we should have a legal responsibility not only to human life, but to the planet? I believe many in the environmental movement are talking about applying R2P, responsibility to protect thinking and principles, the norm, to our work on climate action and broader environmental concerns. So we would love to hear from Professor Weiss. For Safira, a really big question, so be ready for this, but it's that, is a federation of nations, a world federation, the right way forward? So a decentralized system of global governance, or should we, the alternative is being posed in this question, be looking into to rationalizing nations under a single judicial, economic, and operational system, and consciously develop a global culture that will ascribe to it? So either, you know, personal thinking, or if you want to share any insights from the Baha'i faith, is it a unitary super state, the way that nation states are organized, or more of a decentralized system of, but it's still, one would probably imply here, a stronger, probably vastly different UN system for both of those questions. And then finally for Lisa, get the names correct this time, if fake news meets nationalism, it could be, we're seeing it, it's an immense problem, it's a big worry. How can we prevent these two trends from causing greater damage than they already are? If so, how do we solve issues of social conflict by dealing at the same time with the twin issues of fake news and rising nationalism in society, and how the two feed off of one another? If we could kindly hear from you in that order, that would be greatly appreciated. Professor Weiss. Oh, we need your audio back on.
I'm sorry, yeah. That order being starting with me.
Yes.
Hi, Veselin, wherever you are. I think you have to be an inveterate optimist to be in this business. Otherwise, you wouldn't get out of the bed in the morning. But I also think it's important to be, from what I said earlier, a consequentialist, not support some sort of absolute decision-making. And I just want to go back to the responsibility to protect, since that's the way the question was framed. The commissioners, when they were looking at things, somebody said, well, what about Chernobyl? That's a damn mess. Why don't we have a responsibility to come to the rescue? That really was a bridge too far for the commissioners in the year 2000, 2001. And I think it's a bridge too far now. I've been involved in a project that relates to the protection of cultural heritage in the midst of mass atrocities. And it seems much better in terms of getting a result to package the protection of cultural heritage, whether it's Bamiyan or Aleppo or whatever, Mali's, to wrap that up under the protection of human beings and not open yet another way to try to get states to act. And so even though we certainly have a responsibility, and I'd like to think that some of us in our personal lives try to implement a responsibility, a human responsibility toward nature, I really don't think this is the time to move towards codifying a legal responsibility for the human environment.
Thank you, Tom. And on that question posed to you, Safira, about a world federal model or a unitary state, I should have mentioned the name of our questioner, Mr. Daryl Morris. Over to you, Safira.
Thank you so much. And I think this is a really interesting question. And ultimately, I feel like whatever system is devised, it needs to serve the emerging needs and requirements at a particular time. And I think there are many theories and ideas and structures that we can really flesh out. And maybe eventually we will move in one direction or the other. But I think what would really serve us at this particular time is to look at what are the needs and try to devise systems, structures, and reforms that serve the particular moment. Because we have to remember that the system is ultimately operated by people. And there are certain cultures associated with people. There are certain, there's a certain level of understanding and a response to a system that needs to be integrated into a coherent kind of way of operating if we're thinking about something that is serving the global community. So ultimately, I think we can acknowledge that we don't know necessarily what the future of humanity will look like. All of these goals, such as gender equality and peace and prosperity, these are all things that humanity is aspiring towards and working towards over a very long arc of progress. And as we take things step by step, it will emerge and it will become clear to us what the right next step in the system should be. So all of that is to say that I think it will emerge, it will become clear, but that thinking around these ideas as we move from a theoretical idea towards the practical implementation of it will become clear as we take these steps over time.
Thank you, Safira. And the third question to you, Lisa, I should have mentioned the person's name, Jun Hee from South Korea. The issue of fake news meeting nationalism.
Yeah, I think the way I would respond to that is that both fake news and nationalism are instruments of diverting public attention and the accountability of governments. So it's kind of a series in a long history of the kind of nexus between governments and businesses, where you're trying to it's almost like a capture of the means of production, of the means of of natural resources, of the space that publics have to actually dialogue and ask questions. So it's kind of a systematic suppression of any form of questioning or accountability that governments need, or the publics, and particularly communities who are marginalized or traditionally excluded, right? And I think that's the way we need to approach it. So there may be many different symptoms of this kind of attempt to take control away from citizens, including surveillance. I mean, surveillance is, if we've not woken up to it yet, it is going to be the biggest kind of attack on our ability to express, to organize, to really do things together as in terms of a civic, with the civic intent. But I think we consistently need to respond to all of these trends by coming back to the idea of the rights, or the rights of peoples and citizens. And we shouldn't really be dividing our strategies and our attention and our tactics and running after different things in a way that disconnects us from the whole. And I think that's why parts of the UN, like the UN Human Rights Council, are so important, because they remind us constantly of the thread or the fabric that binds us together, right? And my personal preference within the UN system is always for Geneva, because Geneva is the place where I think, especially because civil society and citizens have equal access as observer states, where you really have that moral and that ethical discussion on the values that hold us together, whereas New York is generally seen is the place where the posturing happens, and all of the frivolous conversation on things that really don't matter to anybody on the ground take place. And I think we just need to address that disconnect front, right, and I mean like completely head on. And again, many of the proposals in the UN 75 declaration really speak to that. It really speaks to the idea that the UN is not a system of governments. The UN is a system of people. It's we the people who should be, framing and determining the decision-making process within the UN. And we should be pushing our governments to resource it better and to create the kind of space where we discuss all of the issues, that the people have raised in the chat box, whether it's the biodiversity or the UN, the SDG 17 and partnerships, or the neighborhood parliaments. There's a range of ideas in the chat, and it's up to us really to create that space for the new narrative. And then coming back, therefore, to the fake news, we have to counter fake news with the counter narrative that we create, right? And work better to shape that and make that really the headline that people can connect to, and that inspires really the movements on the ground, to engage with us better.
Thank you, Lisa. And I think you're really going to like this next question. In the next round, I'll go through 3 again, but I'm really hoping, Lisa, you will wish to take on this important question from Corey Buat. And he writes, is it conceivable to strive for a world going forward with no nationalism? This could imply no nation states, maybe, with the UN as a framework modified so that it is a central governance sharing of power and responsibilities directly with grassroots community governments institutions. So a new kind of UN that's really with civil society actors at its heart, maybe the inverse of what we have today and we've had for the last 75 years, although civil society, I would argue, has come on strong since the end of the Cold War. So we'll come to you in a second. And you mentioned, Lisa, in your response about Geneva and how it operates differently than New York. This next gentleman, Arthur Dahl, based in Geneva, and he asked, and I'd like to pose this to Safira, is how can we bring these universal ethical principles of social responsibility that we've been discussing over the last hour or so into public education to counter the present extreme materialistic individualism, something we actually haven't tackled directly in our discussion today. I'm so glad you brought that up. And if Safira could take that. And then finally, our colleague from the UN 2020 initiative, Jeffrey Huffines, this is for you, Tom. He recounts the adoption of the Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights just shortly after the Charter was adopted back in the late 40s. And the challenge continues today to be the enforcement of international law at the supranational level and as well as political agreements. I guess maybe it means supranational regional bodies like the EU. A lot of people are talking about going in that direction with the UN. What concrete global governance proposals would you recommend that would strengthen respect for international law by national governments? Well, Professor Weiss has written books on this, so maybe I'm going to ask you to highlight 1 or 2 of your favorites in a short response. Apologies for that. So over to you, Lisa, first.
Great. In fact, I love that. One of the terms we use very actively in our work in Civicus is translocalism. And the future is, at least the future of civil society and the future of people power is translocal. And I think we shouldn't be waiting for the bigger international and regional bodies to reinvent themselves, because we do have the ability and the opportunities right now to connect very easily across communities and amplify and underscore the priorities that are really important on the ground. And I'm going to pick up on one of the comments in the chat. I think it's Richard Jordan who reacted to my earlier statement on the UN being frivolous. I think what I said was, when you have conversations that don't involve communities and citizens directly, you tend to create a superfluous or a superficial process that doesn't represent ground realities. And that's what we need the UN at all levels, including the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council, to be doing. I mean, continuously reinforcing, connecting, talking to communities, and ensuring that, what we're hearing and what we're serving is not the voices and the narrow interests of nation states, but the larger interests of communities, and which is as the question that was raised, which is beyond, the narrow parameters of security, finance, or the financial interests of governments more specifically.
Thank you. And for the second question, Safira.
Yes, to this point about bringing universal ethical principles into public education, I know that there are some really wonderful initiatives right now, both in terms of formal education and informal education. And we've seen a number of initiatives around new curricula, particularly around global citizenship education or service learning education, national curricula around civic education. And a lot of these elements, I think, both in the formal and the informal educational processes, are really looking to build capacity in young people. And I think when we focus on these kinds of features of capacity building, being able to equip young people with the knowledge, with the skills, with habits to be able to contribute to the collective, we see that every generation of young people are characterized by certain characteristics, and they're shaped by particular forces that are unique to their generation. And to this particular generation, it is these forces of materialism, of individualism, of self-centeredness. It's an online generation, so the way that we're also interacting with technology is quite different. But I think beyond that, this kind of internal yearning and impulse for young people to want to make a meaningful contribution to the world, to be of service to their families and their communities, is very much tied to their education and to be able to contribute through these selfless acts of service. So I think it's very it's something that is emerging, that we're seeing. And in the absence of formal curricula, I think there is a wonderful network that's happening right now in these informal community educational programs that are striving to build these capacities in young people through action and through service in very practical ways.
Thank you so much, Severa. And then the third question, a big one, but if you could focus on one or two of your recent proposals that you could share, Tom, with our colleague Jeff Huffines from the UN 2020 Initiative.
Well, it seems to me that, Richard, since we're talking about global ethic, that what I'm really talking about most of the time is situational ethics. That is, what works, not some vaguer notion of deontology. And I have this argument with my wife all the time, so I'm not going to go into it here, as to whether or not you have to calculate what works. And if you're going to be in this kitchen these days, the nationalist kitchen, you have to be able to stand the heat. I'm going to come at this question by saying that lawyers love supposedly hard pieces of law versus soft pieces of law. And specifically at this question, the day before the Universal Declaration, which is not a piece of hard law, it's just a declaration, the day before it was the Genocide Convention, which is supposedly a hard law. I'd say that probably the Universal Declaration has had more of an impact than the Genocide Convention. And it's important to keep that in mind as trying to figure out what works. And it seems to me that what we need to do is build and slowly on what works. I think most people don't understand that before Nuremberg, during World War II, there was something called the United Nations War Crimes Commission, which had 30,000 cases before it, including such things that we discovered later, such as rape as a war crime. This precedent moves along into post-war. It then moves into, I think we take a huge jump between then and the early 1990s, when we established ad hoc criminal tribunals, which are expensive, don't move along, but some of those experiments then didn't actually look at the previous experience. I remember talking to Richard Goldstone, and he says, why didn't anybody tell me about the UN War Crimes Commission? Of course, rape is a war crime, and they did it back then. Why didn't we build on that? So one of the arguments, I think, is to see what works and not try to only go back to last week, go back farther in history. And it seems to me that what we have seen in building slowly on those experiences and ending up with the International Criminal Court, it's not the be all and end all to our prayers, but it is a step forward. And this is one of the things I've been trying to argue for a long time. Going back in history, building carefully on history is the only way we're going to make any progress. I think not necessarily hallucinating about new visions. I'd like to build on concrete successes and avoid concrete failures.
Thank you so much. At the risk of going over just a few extra minutes beyond, this is the last session of day one, so we have that liberty actually. And we do want to thank, though, everybody's amazing contributions. I will take 3 more and request relatively brief responses, but I think you're going to love these. Dan Perel from New York writes, so this would be for Lisa. And many of the theories of change we see coming forward are based on adversarial approaches in global governance. Yet it's hard to build trust through such an approach. Are there other ways that we can engage in those processes without sacrificing vital principles? And if so, what might they look like? As you know, Lisa, civil society often has the reputation of being on the outside, throwing things in and being really harsh in its criticism and attacking. Is there times to balance that with cooperative approaches as well? For Safira, we have a question from Rose Dyson, and she writes, to what extent do any of the panelists agree with scholars, media pundits, and technology experts that social media is a major force for fueling divisiveness in society and fueling nationalism, hate, and polarization of political and public opinion? So a tough question for you, Safira, to finish us off. And then finally, we have a question for Professor Weiss. You're going to like this one. Many of the proposals that we are seeing in forums like this are trying to either change those in power or change the rules of the game. But the actors and the systems are based on certain narratives that society tells itself. What, in your view, are some of these new narratives that you think might be helpful, given that the old story may not suit current needs? So a very tough question for you. Could write a whole book about that theme, but would love for you to share 1 or 2 final insights. And so over to you, Lisa, for the first question.
Thank you. So one of the things, one more thing that we do at Civicus is publish an annual State of Civil Society report. And we've been doing that for the last 9 years, and next year will be our 10th edition. The one thing we've seen when tracking social uprisings, protest movements, all of the adversarial techniques that civil society is known for in any part of the world, in any context, is the fact that that strategy is used when there is no option for direct participation. So there are, of all the people who are on the streets right now, if you look at the demographic, it's women, it's youth, it's children. These are people who are traditionally excluded from, formal institutions and processes for decision making. These are people who cannot afford to be on the street, calling for their rights. They're losing, their labor, their daily needs. These are people who are also losing their lives or coming under very serious forms of attack, including in the digital space, for just speaking out. So taking on an adversarial position is not a luxury. It's not something that people do from a sense of privilege. It's because there's no other option. And that is why I think reinforcing consistently that the UN reform has to look at the direct means of participation for citizens. It is not okay at a UN General Assembly for civil society to be sitting outside doing side events, like our space is in there. And I think the more governments understand and accept that they need to change their ways of working, they need to embrace the idea of dialogue and dissent and the negotiations that our colleague from the Doha Forum was mentioning earlier, the less then you will have the adversarial options, because nobody is wanting to put their life and livelihood on a line, just for the sake of it, right? You only do it because you've been pushed into a corner or you've been pushed out of the building.
Thank you, Lisa, for those very provocative and thoughtful final responses to our last round of questions. Safira.
Yeah, this is a big question about social media, and just a very brief answer. I think social media it's a tool. And again, it's a tool that has been constructed with deep underlying assumptions about human nature, about society, about its use. And so we have to be very mindful about the way that we use this tool, and also to build both our individual capacity and our collective capacity to use social media in ways that are constructive. And right now, without discipline and without this consideration of the implications of what we're sharing, what we're posting, what we're retweeting, for example, it can lead to fueling some of these things like nationalism and disunity and hate, as we see very much. But it also has our online engagement, no matter what platform that we're on, can also be a tool to allow us to achieve higher and higher degrees of political and social unity. And so we have to be mindful and develop our ability to be discerning, to have an open mind, but to also be discerning about what we read, and also to be very mindful about what we contribute to these online platforms. So I think it's a tool. I think there is a lot of capacity that still needs to be developed around it, and also a lot of thought about the deeper assumptions that tech companies are basing and building these platforms for us. So there is a lot of progress for us in terms of our collective use of social media and media in general.
Thank you, Safira, for those concluding thoughts as well. And last but not least, Tom.
Richard, this is impossible, particularly since I'm now late for another conversation.
Oh, we're so sorry. Well, all the more reason.
It seems to me that in the new narrative are new voices. Someone just said that, and for me, the most important new voices happen to be young people. May have something to do with having grandchildren, one of whom is knocking on the door. But it seems to me working them into the conversation is really important. And nothing I've said should imply that one can be indifferent about the outcomes here. Making calculations is not being indifferent. In fact, one of the best titles ever was by an old friend of mine, was Arthur Helton, who was actually killed in Baghdad during the bombing on UN headquarters. And his book, just finished just before he left out, was called The Price of Indifference, and it was related to refugees. And so nothing I've said in terms of trying to figure out what works and what does not should be interpreted as somehow, throwing up one's hands and saying, the hell with it. The price of indifference is frankly the unlivable planet in which we have, but I'm going to have to stop there.
Thank you so much. And we will absolutely understand if you have to step off immediately as I wrap up this program, but we do want to thank you and Lisa, Safira. Of course, we had Loa on earlier. Your insights, practical recommendations, and uplifting remarks on the necessary moral and ethical underpinnings of global governance remind us how important the formation and then the nurturing of this notion of a global civic ethic will be to take forward the vision and commitments laid out in the declaration to be endorsed by world leaders next week. So let me just do my responsibility as we wrap up this session and welcome your participation, of course, in the forum over the next 2 days. Sorry we didn't get to everybody's question, but there'll be many other opportunities to participate. So please come back and join us. I do want to thank our behind the scenes support team for this and indeed all sessions over this 3-day forum. And of course, to thank all of you for your participation. Great to see we can maintain a high turnout throughout our program today. So we look forward to seeing you for day 2. Keep an eye out for these daily updates. We're starting at exactly the same time that we did today, which is New York time, 9 a.m. Don't miss the opening session tomorrow. We'll lead off with Secretary Madeleine Albright and hearing from our innovation track speakers and scholars, and 20 of the most exciting partnerships with the United Nations, new innovations to get behind the UN 75 Declaration agenda going forward. You'll get to hear all about that tomorrow. You'll get a sneak peek on this entire agenda later today, as well as some of the other resources that we talked about today, including archived videos from all the sessions you might have missed while you were joining us for this program. So thank you once again for joining us, and we hope to see everyone again soon.
Thank you, Richard.